straight recording. How's he look? How's his cell look? Is he sketching or drawing? He is. What's he sketching?
We've tried to study him, of course, but he's much too sophisticated for the standard tests. Oh my, does he hate us? Things aren't his nemesis. Crawford's good. When she's finished growing up.
Morning.
Dr. Lecter, my name is Clarice Starling. Can I speak with you?
You're one of Jack Rawlins, aren't
I am, yes.
you? You use Evian skin cream. Sometimes you wear out lead.
No, you ain't.
The census taker once tried to test.
Welcome to the Cineflux. And if you are here right now, if you found this channel and pressed play on this particular essay, then I think you already know what kind of space this is. This is not the place you come to find out what happened in a film. This is the place you come to understand how a film happened to you. Tonight we are stepping into one of the most mythologized pieces of American cinema ever committed to celluloid. A film that has been called a masterpiece so many times by so many voices for so many decades that the word itself has worn smooth around it, the way a stone wears smooth when too many hands have passed over it. And here's the thing about smooth stones, they are beautiful to hold, but sometimes you cannot feel the edges anymore. I want to feel the edges with you tonight. I want to look at this film honestly, not through the legend it has become, but through the experience of actually sitting with it. So let us begin. Let us go inside. There are films that arrive into the world quietly, find their audience slowly, and grow into their reputation over years. And then there are films that land like a weight dropped from a great height, films that hit culture with such force that the crater they leave behind becomes part of the landscape itself. The Silence of the Lambs, released in February of 1991, belongs emphatically to the second kind. It did not creep into the conversation, it did not build quietly. It arrived, it overwhelmed, and it almost immediately began to become something larger than itself, a cultural shorthand, a reference point, a kind of shared language that people who had never even seen the film somehow still spoke fluently. A decade later, you could say the name Hannibal Lecter in any room in the Western world and watch recognition move across every face. That kind of cultural penetration is extraordinarily rare. It is worth asking, before we say a single word about the film itself, what conditions had to exist in the world to make that possible? Because films do not become legends in a vacuum. They become legends because the world is ready for them. Consider the America that this film stepped into in early 1991. The Cold War, which had defined the psychological architecture of American national identity for nearly half a century, had just ended. But the sense of safety its ending was supposed to bring had not yet arrived. The Gulf War had begun just weeks before the film's release. There was a profound unease running underneath the surface of American life that the news could not entirely account for and politicians could not entirely address. It was the kind of anxiety that does not have a clean target, the kind that circulates without attachment, looking for somewhere to land. And here is what cinema has always understood about that kind of anxiety. It needs a face, it needs a name, it needs to be made visible before it can be confronted. Serial killer cinema, which had been building in American culture through the 1980s with films and real world cases that blurred together in the public imagination, had given that anxiety a face. The predator in the dark, the monster in human clothing, the person who looked ordinary from the outside and contained something incomprehensible within. That figure had been circulating through American consciousness for years before this film arrived. What The Silence of the Lambs did, and this is part of what made it so immediately overwhelming, was to elevate that figure to something approaching the philosophical. It did not just give the monster a face, it gave the monster a voice, an elegant, devastating, intellectually seductive voice, and it asked you to listen. The culture conversation around gender and professional power was also shifting in ways that would inflect how this film was received. 1991 was the year of the Anita Hill testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, an event that crystallized for millions of people exactly how male-dominated institutional spaces could function to silence, diminish, and disbelieve women. The film had already been shot and was in distribution when that testimony happened, but the atmosphere it arrived into was one where the question of what it cost a woman to navigate a world of institutions built by and for men was alive and urgent in ways it had not been in quite the same form before. And here is a young woman named Clarice Starling, an FBI trainee, navigating exactly that world, outnumbered in every room she enters, measured and assessed by eyes that will never quite let her forget her difference, trying to solve the most important case of her career while also managing the constant low-level labor of surviving in a space that was not built for her. That resonance was not accidental. Thomas Harris had written it into his source novel in 1988. Jonathan Demme had felt it deeply enough to center the entire visual grammar of his adaptation on it. And audiences in 1991 felt it in their bodies before they could articulate it in words. That is what great popular art does. It arrives at the exact moment the cultural nervous system is ready to receive it. The critical reception was, by any measure, extraordinary. Here was a film that occupied the uncomfortable overlap between the thriller and the horror film, two genres that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had spent decades treating as beneath serious consideration, and it swept the Oscars with a completeness that had not been seen in nearly 40 years. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay, the so-called Big Five. The last film before it to accomplish that had been One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, and before that, the original sweep had been achieved by It Happened One Night in 1934. We are talking about a list of 3 films in the entire history of the Academy. That fact alone tells you something about the seismic quality of what people felt when they encountered this film in that particular moment. It was not merely liked, it was not merely appreciated. It was felt as a kind of necessary achievement, as though cinema had finally done something it had been approaching for years without quite arriving. And yet there were voices present from the beginning that were not celebrating. The LGBTQ plus community, and in particular transgender advocates, raised serious objections to the portrayal of the film's secondary antagonist, a man who skins his victims and whose psychology the film at various points frames in proximity to questions of gender identity, despite explicitly and somewhat awkwardly distancing itself from that connection through dialogue. These objections were not fringe positions. They came from people who understood, with painful clarity, what it means to see yourself, or something that resembles you in the public imagination, rendered as monstrous on screen. The film's defenders argued, and continue to argue, that the psychological portrait is more nuanced than a simple equation. The film's critics argued and continue to argue that nuance does not undo the damage done when representation is already scarce and the representation that does exist is draped in horror. This conversation has not ended. In some ways, it has only deepened as the decades have passed and the discourse around gender identity has grown more sophisticated and more urgent. It is a genuine tension inside the film that I want to return to later in this essay, because I think it is part of what sits uneasily at the film's center, and part of what accounts honestly for my own complicated relationship with it. But the cultural life of this film has not been limited to its first theatrical run. Like all genuine landmarks, it found new audiences with each new platform and each new generation. The arrival of home video meant that it circulated widely and freely through the 1990s, becoming a film that teenagers discovered on late-night cable and in rental stores. A film that carried, in that context, a kind of transgressive glamour, a sense that you were watching something that had been deemed important by the serious world, but that also delivered the visceral pleasures of genuine cinema. Then streaming brought it to a generation who came to it already knowing the iconography, the mask, the fava beans, the lotion in the basket, before they had ever seen a single frame. That is a strange way to encounter a film. It means the film's most famous moments have already been diffused for you, pre-digested, turned into reference before they can be experienced as shock. I want to think about what that does to a film's power, and I want to think about whether a film's power should depend on shock in the first place. Is this a film that feels timeless, or is it perfectly precisely of its time? The honest answer is that it is both, and that those two qualities exist in genuine tension with each other. The procedural architecture, the FBI trainee, the serial killer profiling, the race against time, belongs completely to a very specific era of American crime fiction and cinema. The visual grammar, the editing rhythms, even some of the production design, are marred to the particular texture of early 1990s filmmaking in ways that become more apparent as time passes. But the psychological core, the question of what it costs to look into darkness and remain yourself, the question of what power does to people who do not have it and people who do, the question of what we are willing to offer of ourselves in exchange for knowledge we desperately need, those questions do not age. They simply change shape, which is perhaps the most precise definition of a film that endures, not one that transcends its time, but one that was rooted so deeply in something true that the roots hold even as the surface changes. Now, let me tell you about the film itself as a film before we go any deeper. The Silence of the Lambs released on the 14th of February 1991, and there is something worth noticing in that date, in the choice to release this particular story on Valentine's Day, as though the film knew exactly what kind of love it was inviting you into, is directed by Jonathan Demme and adapted by Ted Talley from Thomas Harris's 1988 novel. It stars Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling, a young woman training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and Anthony Hopkins as Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a former psychiatrist and convicted serial killer who is being held in a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. The third central figure is the film's antagonist, a serial killer known to investigators as Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine in a performance that operates in a completely different register from everything else in the film, and not always comfortably so. At its structural heart, this is a film about transaction, about what you give in order to get. Clarice needs information that only Lecter possesses, information that might lead her to Buffalo Bill and save his current victim before she's killed. Lecter will give that information, but not freely. He will trade it in pieces for access to Clarice, to her history, her fears, the private geography of her interior life. Every exchange between them is a negotiation conducted at the highest possible psychological stakes. And what makes those exchanges so compulsively watchable, what gives them their extraordinary energy, is the fact that both figures in them are genuinely intelligent and genuinely dangerous in entirely different ways. Lecter is dangerous because he is contained and brilliant and completely without the moral architecture that restrains most human beings. Clarice is dangerous because she is perceptive and desperate and has, somewhere beneath the professional composure, something that cannot be broken, a quality of selfhood that Lecter finds genuinely rare and genuinely fascinating. The film understands that these two qualities in collision will generate something extraordinary. It's right about that. Tonitemi was, at the time of this film, a director with a deeply varied and humanist body of work. He had made something wild and married to the mob and stopped making sense films that were warm, socially conscious, and alive with a very particular kind of American energy. He was not a horror director. He was not a genre director in the conventional sense, and that, I would argue, is precisely what gave his approach to this material its specific quality. He brought to it the concern of a filmmaker who was interested not in the thriller mechanics for their own sake, but in what those mechanics were doing to the human beings caught inside them. The famous close-ups in this film, the direct-to-camera addresses that make Lecter's scenes feel so searingly uncomfortable, are not a horror director's instinct. They are a humanist director's instinct. They are a way of refusing to let you sit safely in the seat of the observer. They put you into the scene. They make the discomfort personal. That is a specific artistic choice, and it shapes the entire experience of the film in ways that go beyond technique. Jodie Foster was 30 years old when this film was released. She had been acting professionally since childhood, had been through experiences on and near film sets that no child should have to navigate, had built a career of extraordinary range and intelligence, and brought to Clarice Starling a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe but immediately recognizable on screen, a quality of concentrated, slightly compressed selfhood, as though everything she carries is being held very carefully just below the surface at all times. Anthony Hopkins had been acting for decades on stage and screen, but had never had a role that would attach his name to popular culture in the way that Lecter would. He was reportedly on screen for somewhere in the range of 16 minutes across the entire film, a number that has become one of cinema's most cited statistics because it feels impossible given the size of the presence those scenes create. Scott Glenn plays the head of the FBI's Behavior Sciences Unit, a man who has looked into darkness so long that the darkness has begun to look back. And Ted Levine brings to his role a physical and psychological strangeness that the film both depends on and, in some ways, does not quite know what to do with. What kind of story is this at its heart? It is a question worth sitting with before you watch it and worth sitting with again after. On the surface, it is a procedural, a race against time, a chase, a series of investigative breakthroughs. Beneath the surface, it is something closer to a psychological dual portrait, a study of two very different kinds of intelligence forced into intimacy by circumstance. And beneath even that, I think, it is asking something about the nature of empathy itself, about what it means to understand another person so completely that you can predict their behavior, anticipate their choices, inhabit their perspective, and whether that kind of understanding is in itself a form of power that carries its own moral weight. The deepest question is what elevates this film above pure genre entertainment. Whether it answers that question, whether it earns the depth it reaches for, is something I will return to at length. You should see this film. If you have not, I am going to ask you to see it before this essay ends and we enter full spoiler territory. Not because it is perfect, not because it will deliver exactly what its reputation promises, but because it is a genuinely important piece of cinema, important for what it got right, important for what it accounted, important even for what it got wrong, and because there are performances inside it that deserve to be experienced before they are described. There's a reason this film has been discussed, debated, defended, and dissected for more than 30 years. Even at a complicated relationship, even at a 5.2 out of 10, I find myself returning to it, not with pleasure exactly, but with the particular attention that only certain films can demand. That attention is worth something. I want to tell you why. Let me tell you about the first time I sat with this film. Because I think that first experience, what you bring to it, what it does with what you bring, and what it leaves you with that you did not arrive carrying, is actually essential to understanding what this film is and what it is not. And I say that because The Silence of the Lambs is one of those rare films where the distance between its reputation and its actual experience is not a small gap you barely notice. It is hourly Magellan. Wide enough, in fact, that the experience of watching it for the first time is almost always an experience of negotiation, a quiet, continuous recalibration between what you are to expect and what a film is actually offering you in any given moment. I came to this film already knowing too much. I think most people who encounter it now, in the age of streaming and cultural omniscience, arrive in exactly this condition, already holding the mask, already carrying the fava beans, already hearing the voice doing the impression of the voice doing the impression, layer upon layer of cultural repetition between you and the actual film. And here is what I want to say about that condition. Before we go any further, it is not entirely the film's fault, but it is also not something the film entirely survives, because certain things in cinema depend, with a dependency that cannot be replaced, on the experience of genuine surprise. The first time something truly unexpected happens on screen, the first time a film does something you did not know cinema could do, that lands in a specific place in your nervous system that can never be reached again through the same door. You can add mechanism afterward, you can appreciate the architecture, but the original sensation is unrepeatable, and for certain films, that original sensation is a very large part of what the film actually is. I want to be honest about this because I think the honesty matters for everything that follows. When I pressed play, I expected grandeur. I expected the kind of relentless psychological intensity that the film's reputation had constructed for me over years of accumulated references and second-hand encounters. I expected to be unsettled in a way that would feel transformative. What I encountered instead, particularly in the film's first act, was something more measured and more procedural than I had anticipated, something quieter, something that asked more patience than the legend had suggested. And I want to be careful here because I am not saying that is a flaw, at least not entirely. I am saying that it created a specific experience of watching, a specific kind of presence the film required of me that I had not been prepared for and that I found myself alternately grateful for and restless inside of. That tension between patience rewarded and patience tested is something I want to stay with throughout this essay because I think it is close to the heart of what this film actually is as opposed to what it has become. The opening image of this film is one that I have returned to many times since, and each time I return to it, I find something slightly different waiting there. We are in a forest. The light is grey and diffused, the kind of flat morning light that does not flatter anything and reveals everything. We hear sound before we fully understand what we are seeing, the sound of exertion, of physical effort, of a body moving through space with focused intention. And then we find her, a young woman running alone through a training course in the woods, pulling herself up ropes and over walls, breathing hard, moving with the particular determination of someone who is proving something to a superior, to an institution, to herself. It is not yet clear which. What is immediately and unmistakably clear, even in these first seconds, is that she is alone in a way that goes beyond the literal solitude of the frame. She is alone in the way that people are alone when they have been required to be self-sufficient for so long that the self-sufficiency has become a kind of second skin. When she pauses and looks up at a handwritten note pinned to a tree, a note from someone above her, someone with institutional authority over her path, the way her face processes what she reads tells you almost everything you need to know about her relationship to the world she is trying to enter. She does not react with resentment or despair. She reacts with a kind of practiced resolution. She has been here before. She will be here again. She will keep going. That image, that young woman alone in a grey forest, running towards something she is not yet permitted to reach, is the emotional thesis of this entire film rendered in a single shot. Jonathan Demme knew exactly what he was doing, and what strikes me most, returning to it now, is how completely unadorned it is. There is no musical grandeur here, no cinematographic flourish, no composition designed to declare its own beauty. It is simply a woman moving through a world that was built for someone else, in light that offers no warmth, toward a destination that keeps receding. Cinema does this kind of thing well when it trusts its images completely, and Demme in this opening trusts completely. The atmosphere that the film creates in its early minutes is one of institutional cold. This is a world of corridors and fluorescent lighting and men in identical clothing moving through spaces that have been designed for efficiency rather than humanity. The FBI Academy at Quantico, as Demme presents it, is a place where the architecture itself participates in a kind of subtle diminishment, where the sheer scale and masculinity of the physical environment communicates, without a single word of dialogue, that this space was not imagined with Clarice Starling in mind. And the camera crucially stays close to her face in these early scenes. We do not get the institutional establishing shots that a more conventional thriller might have leaned on. We get her. We get the way her eyes process each new environment, cataloging it, assessing it, finding her position within it, with the practiced speed of someone who has spent a lifetime doing exactly this kind of calculation in exactly this kind of room. Demme is doing something very specific here. He is not showing you the institution. He is showing you what it feels like to be Clarice inside the institution. That distinction is everything. And then she is called in to see the head of the behavioral sciences unit, and the world of the film shifts into its operational register. She is being given a task. Not a real assignment, not yet, but something adjacent to one. Something that could become one if she performs well enough, if she's careful enough, if she is careful enough, if she understands correctly what is being asked of her and what is not. She is to visit a prisoner, a specific prisoner, one whose name, when her superior speaks it, carries a weight that the film has not yet earned through its own images, but that it borrows, in this moment, from the cultural weight the name already carries in the word of the story. She is to attempt to administer a psychology questionnaire. She is to try to establish a rapport. She is, in other words, being sent into a situation she is not equipped for, without adequate preparation, by people who need something from her that they are not entirely willing to name. And here is what the film understands about this. Here is where it does something rare, something that a lesser thriller would have flattened into simple genre mechanics. The transaction being proposed to Clarice by her institutional superiors is structurally identical to the transaction that Lecter will propose to her from behind his glass wall. In both cases, she is being asked to give something of herself in exchange for something that the other party holds and will not release freely. In both cases, the power differential is enormous and the terms are not entirely hers to negotiate. The film is already in this institutional hallway, doing what it will do in the basement cell, and its structural echo is not accidental. It is the film's most quietly sophisticated idea. The drive toward the institution where Lecter is held is rendered in a way that I want to linger on, because it is a piece of filmmaking that operates almost entirely through implication and atmosphere rather than explicit narrative information. We see Clarice arriving at what is presented as a facility that exists slightly outside the ordinary world, architecturally distinctive, institutionally strange, staffed by people whose relationship to the extraordinary nature of what they contain every day has produced in them a particular brand of dark insider humor that functions as a coping mechanism and as a warning simultaneously. The man who runs this facility and who will be Clarice's guide through it played with a kind of oleaginous institutional cordiality that makes your skin contract slightly, is already, before she has descended to the lower level where Lecter is kept, beginning to position her, beginning to set the terms, beginning subtly and with practiced ease to use her in his own ongoing negotiation with his most famous resident. And Clarice, who is perceptive enough to feel this happening, does not have sufficient standing to object. She notes it, she stores it, she continues. The descent to Lecter's level of the facility is one of the great architectural passages in American cinema. I do not use that phrase lightly, and I want to explain what I mean by it. The physical journey Clarice makes through one set of locked doors after another, past cells holding figures whose disturbance the film gestures toward without lingering on, into a corridor of white painted stone that narrows around her as she moves forward, is doing the work that language could not do with nearly the same efficiency. It is externalizing her psychological state. The further she goes, the more the space contracts. The more the space contracts, the more isolated she becomes. The more isolated she becomes, the more exposed she is, stripped of the institutional context that gave her whatever provisional authority she arrived with, until she is simply a person walking toward another person, and all the institutional scaffolding has fallen away. By the time she reaches the glass wall and finds him standing there waiting, already watching, already smiling, she has been prepared by the architecture itself for the particular kind of vulnerability that their exchange will require. Tame understood that the physical journey was an emotional journey. He built it accordingly. And here's the first thing I want to say about Anthony Hopkins in this role, and it is something that I think often gets lost in the accumulated mythology of the performance. What he does in the first moment you see him is nothing. Or rather, it appears to be nothing. He is standing still, he is looking, he is utterly composed. There is no telegraphing of menace, no theatrical signaling of danger. He is simply present with an intensity of presence that the camera, and through the camera you immediately and involuntarily registers as different in kind from ordinary human presence. The danger is not in what he does, it is in the quality of his stillness. It is in the sense completely and immediately condensing that this stillness is not the stillness of repose, but the stillness of something that has chosen, for now, not to move. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to convey through a performance. It requires a kind of absolute physical and psychological control that very few actors possess. Hopkins possesses it completely. And in this first moment, without a single dramatic action, he establishes everything the film will need you to believe about this character for the next hour and a half. Their first exchange is a masterclass in the writing of psychological combat, conducted at the level of pure language and implication. She presents her credentials, her reason for being there, her official purpose, and he disassembles them with a precision and a pleasure that is genuinely chilling, not because it is cruel, but because it is so clearly the natural functioning of an intelligence that has been placed in a situation that almost never offers it adequate stimulation. He is not performing cruelty, he is experiencing genuine interest. And the interest, you realize almost immediately, is not primarily in the questionnaire or the official purpose or even in the information she is seeking from him. It is in her, in the gap between what she says she is and what she actually is, in the particular texture of her composure, the places where it holds perfectly, and the places where it holds perfectly, and the places where very faintly it strains. He finds those places the way a musician finds a note, not by searching but by listening. What Jodie Foster does in these scenes is something I keep returning to, because I think it is the true center of the film. Not Hopkins, not the thriller mechanics, not the procedural race against time, but Foster's rendering of what it cost Clarice to be in this room at all. There is a quality in her performance of what I can only describe as chosen exposure. She understands before she enters that she will have to offer something real of herself in order to get anything back. She has made a decision, consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of the risk, to be genuinely present, genuinely available to his perception, in a way that a more self-protective person could not manage. And she does this not because she does not feel the danger, but because she has concluded that the danger is worth the information. That calculus, the willingness to be truly seen in exchange for knowledge you desperately need, is, I would argue, the moral core of her character. and Foster carries it in her body, in the set of her jaw, in the specific quality of her eye contact. You believe it completely. You believe it even when, perhaps especially when, it frightens her. The first session ends. She has learned something, she has paid for it. She is not entirely sure what she paid, or whether the exchange was worth it, or what he has taken from the encounter that she does not yet know he has taken. And she walks back up through the narrowing corridor, through the locked doors, back into the daylight, and there is something in the way Demi holds on her face in those final moments of the sequence that tells you the film is not going to be what you thought it was going to be. This is not a thriller about a monster, or not only that. This is something more interior, more uncomfortable, more genuinely interested in its protagonist as a fully realized human being than most films in this genre ever allow themselves to be. Then the world of the film expands. The investigation proper begins to develop its other dimension. Buffalo Bill, the active case, the woman being held somewhere while the clock runs. And here is where I want to talk about the film's structural intelligence, because it is doing something architecturally sophisticated that I think does not get discussed enough. It is running two narrative logics simultaneously, and those two logics operate at completely different temperatures. The Lecter scenes, which we have just begun to inhabit, are cold, contained, precise, almost theatrical in their staging and execution. They exist in a world of stillness and language and psychological intricacy. The Buffalo Bill investigation, the active case, the real-time urgency operates at the other temperature entirely. It is hot, procedural, moving outwards than inward, driven by information and physical action rather than psychological depth. And the film moves between these two temperatures with an assurance that keeps the whole structure from ever feeling slack or uneven. When you are with Lecter, you are in a world of timeless, almost philosophical stillness. When you are with the investigation, you are inside a clock that is running. The alternation between those two registers is what generates the film's particular kind of tension, not the constant revving of pure thriller mechanics, but something more irregular and therefore more genuinely unsettling. The case opens outward. Bodies are found, evidence accumulates. Clarice is in the field, working, applying the analytical training she is still in the process of receiving, and we watch her process evidence with the particular focus of someone who is simultaneously doing the job and learning the job and being judged on the job, and also always managing the ambient friction of being one of the only women in every room she enters. This last element is not the film's explicit subject. It is never the stated scene, never the announced concern, but it is present in every frame, in every interaction, in every subtle recalibration she performs when a male colleague speaks to her in a particular way, or assesses her with a particular look, or makes an assumption about her based on information that has nothing to do with her actual competence. The film trusts you to see this without being told to see it. That trust is one of its genuine achievements. She returns to Lecter. The exchanges deepen. He asks her things she does not want to answer, and she answers them anyway because she has already, in the first session, made a decision about what his relationship requires of her. He gives her things. Fragments, implications, puzzles rather than answers that she takes back into the investigation and applies with a precision that startles her colleagues. And we begin to understand the strange symbiosis at work here. She is not simply extracting information from him, she is being trained, shaped, taught to think in a way that his intelligence makes possible and that conventional institutional training cannot replicate. And he is not simply being entertained by her. He is, and this is the film's most quietly disturbing suggestion, genuinely interested in her welfare, genuinely invested in her success in a way that exists in impossible tension with everything else he is and everything else he has done. The film does not resolve this tension, it lives inside it. Whether that refusal to resolve is a mark of sophistication or of avoidance is something I will return to. The investigation takes Clarice to places that the film handles with varying degrees of success. There is a sequence involving the discovery of a victim's past, a sequence that requires her to do what investigators of violent crime must sometimes do, which is to reconstruct a life from its ending. That is among the most emotionally intelligent passages in the film, because Clarice does not approach this victim story as a professional gathering data She approaches it as a person encountering another person's loss. She is careful with what she finds. She is respectful in a way that the film does not explain or announce but simply shows. And this is the kind of moment that for me is where Foster's performance becomes something more than craft. You feel in the way she moves through this environment, in the specific attention she pays to what is there, the weight of a genuine empathy that has not been dulled by professional exposure. She carries these people with her. That is what makes her good at what she does. And that is also what makes what she does cost her something. The relationship with Lecter continues to evolve with each visit, and the evolution is so carefully calibrated. The degrees by which he reveals more of himself, the degrees by which she allows herself to be more fully seen, that you almost do not notice how far they have traveled from the starting point of the first exchange until you look back and realize the distance. He has become, in a way that the film both acknowledges and is slightly troubled by, something close to an ally, not a friend. That word does not apply to what he is or what he is capable of, but an ally in the specific, transactional, mutually dependent sense. She needs what he knows, he needs what she is. The terms are not equal and can never be equal, but within those unequal terms, something that functions like trust has been constructed brick by brick, exchange by exchange. And that constructed trust is the film's most genuinely complex relationship, not because it is romantic, which the film is careful to keep it from being, but because it is real. It is a real relationship between two real intelligences, conducted under impossible conditions, and it has produced something that neither of them entirely planned for and that neither of them entirely knows what to do with. The procedural investigation develops, new information arrives, new dead ends are encountered and worked around. The film's pacing here, in the middle of its second act, is something I want to address with honesty, because it is one of the places where my experience of the film diverged from what its reputation had prepared me for. The middle section is slower than it needs to be, not in all of its passages. There are moments of real procedural momentum, real investigative excitement, real forward drive. But there are also stretches where the film seems to be simply accumulating information rather than transforming it into feeling, and where the thriller mechanics begin to feel, for the first time, genuinely mechanical rather than purposeful. The question of whether this is Demme deliberately forcing patience in order to make the urgency of the third act feel more earned, or whether it is simply uneven pacing, is one that I have gone back and forth on and have not fully resolved. What I can say is that these passages tested my engagement in ways that the film's finest moments do not, and that the testing is noticeable enough to be worth naming. And then, and here is the moment the film has been building toward, the structural pivot that changes the temperature of everything that comes after it. Clarice makes a discovery. A connection is made between a piece of evidence she has been sitting with and something Lecter told her that she had not yet found the full application for. And in a moment of that connection, the film snaps into a different kind of focus entirely. The procedure becomes personal. The investigation, which had been moving outward through the conventional channels of institutional crime solving, suddenly turns and aims itself somewhere new and much more urgent. The clock that the film had been running at a manageable distance suddenly comes close, and Clarice, who has been patient and methodical and careful and contained, is now running not metaphorically, not aspirationally, as she was in the opening image, but with a real destination and a real urgency and a real life that depends on how fast she can move and how clearly she can think. This is where the film shifts completely. This is where the two temperatures we have been moving between, the cold philosophical space of the Lecter exchanges and the hot procedural urgency of the investigation, begin to approach each other, begin to press against each other with an increasing force that the film has been carefully building towards since its first frame. And here is what I keep returning to about this moment. It does not feel like a plot development. It feels like an emotional one. It feels like something has been released in Clarice, some constraint, some held breath quality that has been present in her since the opening image of her running alone through that grey forest, and that what has been released is not confidence or certainty, but something more specific and more fierce, a willingness. a decision, something that she has perhaps been waiting for the entire film to call on. And here is where I will ask you to stay with me for the next section of this essay, because where the film goes from this moment, the choices it makes, the craft it brings, the things it achieves, and the things it achieves and the things it fails to achieve, is where the most important conversation about this film actually lives. There is a question that I find myself returning to every time I think seriously about a film that has lodged itself inside me in the complicated way this one has. And the question is not simply what a film is or what it means or even what it achieves. The question is how it came to exist at all. How the specific configuration of decisions, accidents, compromises, inspirations, and human choices that produce these particular images in this particular order ever arrived at a convergence point. Because every film is, at its most fundamental level, an improbable event, a gathering of circumstances that did not have to go this way, that could have gone 100 different ways, and that arrived at this specific outcome through a process that is always in retrospect almost impossible to fully reconstruct. Understanding that process does not explain the magic of the result, but it deepens your relationship to it. It gives you more to see, and seeing more, always seeing more, is what this channel is about. So let me take you inside the making of this film. Let me take you behind the images, behind the performances, behind the extraordinary craft that is visible on screen, into the decisions and discoveries and accidents that made it possible. Because this is one of those productions where the behind the scenes story is not merely interesting as biographical footnote, it actively reshapes how you see the finished film. It gives certain moments an additional layer of meaning that they carry more richly once you understand what produced them. It makes the film in certain respects more human, more contingent, more improbable, more genuinely achieved than the seamlessness of the final product might otherwise suggest. Begin with the source. Thomas Harris published his novel in 1988, and it was immediately recognizable as something different from conventional thriller fiction. Harris had introduced Hannibal Lecter in an earlier novel, Red Dragon, published in 1981, where Lecter had been a supporting figure, a source of expertise consulted by another investigator in another case. That novel had been adapted for the screen in 1986 under the title Manhunter, directed by Michael Mann, with Brian Cox playing Lecter in a manner completely unlike what Hopkins would later bring, cooler, more clinical, more procedural in its menace. That film had not been a significant commercial success and had not lodged in the cultural imagination in the way that The Silence of the Lambs would. But it had planted seeds. It had established, for those paying attention, that the Lecter character could sustain a cinematic treatment. When Harris moved Lecter from supporting figure to central intelligence in his 1988 novel, building around him an entirely new protagonist in Clarice Starling, he produced something that the publishing world immediately recognized as a major work. The novel was a bestseller almost immediately upon release. The film rights inevitably were acquired quickly. Here is the first thing that I keep returning to when I think about the development history of this film, and it is something that reshapes how you see the finished product in a very specific way. For a significant period before Jonathan Demme was attached, the project had been associated in various capacities, at various stages, with Gene Hackman, who had reportedly been interested not only in acting in an adaptation, but in directing one. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what a Hackman-directed version of this material might have been. Hackman is one of the great American screen actors of his generation, a performer of extraordinary stylistic power and democratic humanism, but his sensibility as a potential director would have been completely different from Demme's. The film that might have emerged from that version of the project, whatever form it might eventually have taken, would almost certainly have been, in terms of visual language and psychological temperature, a profoundly different object. The Demme film we have is so specifically Demme's film, so shaped by his particular humanist sensibility, his specific concern for the interior life of his protagonist, his willingness to use visual drama in the service of empathy rather than style, that it is genuinely difficult to imagine it arriving through any other creative intelligence. But it almost did not arrive to Demis, And that near miss is worth sitting with, because it reminds you that the film you are watching is not inevitable, it is chosen. It is the result of a specific person's specific vision applied to specific material at a specific moment. Remove any one of those variables and the film that exists does not exist. When Demi came to the project, he brought something with him that is perhaps the most important single contribution any director can make to an adaptation. He brought a clear and deeply felt sense of whose story this was. The novel, like many psychological thrillers, has a certain centrifugal quality. It pulls outward toward its most extreme and spectacular elements, toward Lecter and the horror of what he represents, toward the procedural machinery of investigation. Demi's instinct, according to interviews he gave during and after the production, was centripetal. He wanted to pull everything inward, toward Clarice, toward her experience, toward the specific quality of her consciousness as she moves through this world. Every major visual and structural decision he made during the production flows from that initial and fundamental orientation. The direct-to-camera close-ups, the way the camera stays close to her face in the institutional spaces, the specific lighting choices that make the Lecter self feel like a different world from the world Clarice inhabits in the rest of the film. All of it comes from one man's clear answer to the question that every director must answer when they sit down with a piece of material: whose film is this? The casting of Jodie Foster is a story that I find genuinely illuminating about what this film was trying to be, and about the particular kind of courage that real artistic commitment sometimes requires. It has been widely reported that Foster was not the only actress seriously considered for the role of Clarice Starling. Several other names were reportedly discussed at various stages, including Michelle Pfeiffer and Meg Ryan, actresses of significant talent whose work you can imagine in this material, but whose specific qualities would have produced a completely different experience of the character. What Foster brought to Clarice that was, I would argue, irreplaceable and specifically hers, was a quality of interior density, a sense that there is more happening inside this person at any given moment than she will ever fully express, that she carries a weight of history and intelligence and feeling that the surface of her professional composure only partially conceives. That quality did not need to be performed. It was in her presence. It was in the specific way she inhabited physical space, the specific register of her voice, the specific quality of her attention. It was, in other words, not just acting in the conventional sense, not just a skillful rendering of a character through technique, but a genuine convergence between a performer and a role that happens when the thing the role requires most deeply is something the performer actually possesses. Think about what that means for every scene between Clarice and Lecter. Think about what it means that the quality Lecter finds most fascinating in her, that particular rare quality of genuine selfhood, of an interior life that cannot be easily read or easily dismissed, is not something Foster is manufacturing. It is something she is bringing. When Hopkins looks at her and you see the genuine interest in his eyes, part of what is generating that interest is that he is looking at a real person whose presence has the quality the role requires. That kind of accidental truth is one of the most precious things cinema can produce. You cannot plan for it. You can only recognize it when it arrives. Hopkins himself, it has been reported, had a very specific and somewhat unusual approach to preparing for Lecter, one that gives certain details of his performance an additional layer of fascinating intentionality when you understand them. He reportedly read the novel multiple times before the shoot began, not in order to extract information about the character, but in order to absorb the specific rhythm and temperature of the language Harris had used to render Lecter's consciousness. He developed through a process that reportedly involved considerable solitary work, a voice and a manner of physical presence that were specific to this character and to no other role he had played or would play. The voice in particular, that precise, slightly formal, beautifully modulated instrument that feels as though it has been calibrated to a specific frequency and never deviates from it, was not, as far as can be determined from the available record, simply discovered through conventional rehearsal. It was built, constructed with the same kind of deliberate architectural intelligence that Lecter himself would bring to any problem he chose to address. There is something almost too perfect about that parallel, the actor using the same quality of precise, methodical construction that the character uses to build the character. But then, perfect parallels of that kind are sometimes how great performances happen. Now, I want to tell you something about this production that reshaped for me the entire experience of watching the Lecter scenes in a way I did not expect and that I want you to carry into your next viewing of this film. According to various accounts of the production, Hopkins spent a total of somewhere in the range of 2 weeks on set. His scenes, every scene, every exchange, every moment of that shattering presence were shot in that compressed window of time. And his total screen time in the finished film is, by various calculations, somewhere between 16 and 24 minutes depending on how precisely you measure it. Less than a quarter of an hour of screen time. Less time than many films dedicate to a single action set piece. And for that performance, for those 16 to 24 minutes, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. It remains by any reasonable measure the least amount of screen time ever accumulated by a winner in that category. And here is what that fact does to the experience of watching those scenes once you know it. It makes you watch differently. It makes you aware of the extraordinary compression at work, the way every single moment in every scene is carrying weight that a less concentrated performance spread over more screen time would have had more room to distribute. Hawkins could not afford, in those 16 minutes, a single throwaway moment, not a single passage of mere transitional acting, of the kind that even great performers need to get from one peak to the next. Everything had to count. Everything had to be working at maximum intensity and maximum control simultaneously. The economy is staggering when you feel it from the inside, and it reshapes every scene. Because you realize that the stillness, the precision, the extraordinary restraint, none of it is simply a stylistic choice. It is a practical necessity that has been transformed through the alchemy of genuine genius into an artistic one. The physical environment in which those scenes take place is itself a creative achievement that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The cell in which Lecter is kept, that extraordinary, slightly abstract theatrical space, lit from sources that are never quite explained naturalistically, walled in white that seems to emanate its own cold light, fronted by that glass barrier that separates him from the world with a material that is transparent without being permeable, was a constructed set. It was built specifically for this film, designed by production designer Christy, and every decision made about it, from the proportions of the space to the quality of the light to the precise geometry of the glass partition, was a decision made in the service of the specific psychological dynamic that Demi needed those scenes to create. What I find remarkable, returning to those scenes with this knowledge, is how completely the set succeeds in making Lecter feel simultaneously contained and free. The glass wall is absolute. It cannot be breached. It is visually reinforced throughout every scene, and yet he does not feel imprisoned in the way that the other residents of the facility feel imprisoned. He feels instead like a figure who has simply chosen to be here, as though the containment is his own decision, undertaken for his own reasons, and could be reversed at any time he found those reasons insufficient. That psychological effect, the sense of chosen rather than enforced confinement, is produced almost entirely by the set design and lighting, by the specific quality of space the designers gave him to inhabit. By the way, the white walls and the cold light strip away everything that is not essential and leave him standing in a kind of pure abstract environment that his extraordinary interior life fills completely. It is in retrospect exactly the right environment for exactly this character. But it required someone to make that choice. Zia made it and Demi trusted it, and the result is one of the most iconic interior spaces in American film history. Let me tell you something about the film's cinematography that I think represents one of its most significant and frequently misunderstood artistic achievements. Tat Fujimoto, the director of photography on this film, a collaborator of Demi's from earlier projects, developed a specific visual grammar for the Lecter scenes that is worth understanding in technical terms before you can fully appreciate its emotional function. The famous direct-to-camera close-ups in which Lecter addresses Clarice and the camera is positioned so that he appears to be looking directly at you, the viewer, not at her, not at a point somewhere slightly off-axis in the conventional eyeline match construction, but directly into the lens, directly into your eyes, are not standard practice. They represent a deliberate violation of one of the most basic conventions of continuity editing, which dictates that characters in a scene should look at each other rather than at the camera. The convention exists for good reasons. It maintains the coherence of the fictional space. It keeps the viewer in the position of observer rather than participant. It preserves the comfortable fourth wall that allows you to watch without feeling watched. Demi and Fujimoto broke this convention systematically and specifically in the Lecter scenes, and crucially, they broke it asymmetrically. Lecter looks directly at the camera. Clarice does not, or does so much more rarely. She looks slightly off axis at the conventional eyeline that preserves her relationship to the fictional space of the scene. He looks at you. Think about what that asymmetry is doing. Think about what it creates in your experience of those scenes. On one level, it is simply an extremely effective technique for generating discomfort, for making the experience of watching these scenes active and slightly exposed rather than passive and protected. But on a deeper level, it is doing something more precise and more meaningful. It is encoding in the visual grammar of the film itself the power differential that defines every exchange between these two characters. Clarice looks at Lecter, Lecter looks at you, which means that in those moments you are occupying Clarice's position, you are receiving his regard. You are the one being assessed and measured and found interesting or insufficient or promising or transparent. The camera is not showing you the scene. The camera is putting you inside it, and inside it you are her. You are the trainee in the room with the genius who has decided, for reasons not entirely clear, to find you worthy of his attention. That experience is not accidental. It was designed, shot by shot, look by look, with a full awareness of what it would do to a viewer who had never been prepared for it. And this is, I think, the single most important piece of craft in the entire film. Not the most spectacular, not the most technically difficult, but the most essential, the piece of craft that, more than anything else, makes those scenes feel the way they feel, other than simply look the way they look. Fujimoto's work in the rest of the film operates at a different but equally considered level. The institutional spaces, the academy, the facilities corridors, the autopsy rooms, the field investigation locations are rendered in a palette of desaturated grays and browns and institutional greens that communicate, without any explicit statement, the specific quality of a world that has been drained of warmth. Not dramatically, not with the heightened expressionism of a film that wants you to notice its visual choices, but subtly, in the way that real institutional spaces are subtly draining, in the way that you do not necessarily notice the quality of the light until you step outside into something different and realize how much the interior light was taking from you. Against this palette, Clarice's face, and Foster's face specifically, with its particular quality of concentrated luminosity, becomes a source of warmth in an environment that contains almost none. The camera gravitates toward her face the way you would gravitate toward a fire in a cold room. Not because the filmmakers are telling you to find her beautiful or sympathetic, but because in the visual world they have constructed, the quality of aliveness that her face carries is genuinely, photographically warmer than everything around it. That is an extraordinary thing to achieve through cinematography. It is achieved here so naturally that most viewers never consciously notice it. They simply feel it. They feel slightly warmer when the camera is on her face and slightly colder when it is not. The film has rigged your emotional experience with light. The score by Howard Shore, who would go on years later to compose one of the great film scores of any era for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is a work that I think rewards much more attention than it typically receives in discussions of this film, which tend to focus so exclusively on the performances and the direction that the music gets treated as background. But Shore's score is not background. It is, in several of the film's most important sequences, the primary carrier of emotional information. And what makes it remarkable is not its moments of dramatic intensity, the passages of dissonance and orchestral darkness that you might expect from a film of this kind, but its moments of restraint. Its moments of near silence, its willingness to let sequences breathe without musical support, and then to arrive with something unexpected when it does arrive. The score for the Lecter scenes is, by deliberate choice, almost entirely absent. Those scenes run for the most part without underscore. The silence is not empty. It is a positive presence, a choice, a statement, a refusal, so understood that to put music under those exchanges would be to reduce them, to tell the audience what to feel, when the entire point of those scenes is that what you feel should be uncertain, unstable, unresolved. Music resolves, music tells you the emotional direction. The absence of music in the Lecter scenes says, you are on your own here. Figure out what this is. And that instruction delivered through silence rather than sound is part of what makes those scenes so genuinely uncomfortable. You have been left without the emotional guidance track that cinema usually provides. You have to navigate the experience yourself. And in that self-navigation, your own psychology becomes part of the film. Where Shaw does use music in the investigative passages, in the sequences of physical movement and forward procedural momentum, he employs a vocabulary that is deliberately understated for the genre. There is no swelling manipulative score here, of the kind that certain thriller composers use like a crowbar to pry feeling out of you. Shore's music, in the moments when it is present, has a quality of muted urgency, like the sound of something being held back rather than the sound of something being released. It accompanies the investigation rather than dramatizing it. It adds texture and forward motion without overwhelming the naturalistic register that Demi is working to maintain throughout. And in the film's final sequence, a passage I will discuss in full detail in the spoiler section, Shore does something with the score that is, when you understand what it is doing, genuinely sophisticated and genuinely moving. But that is for later. Let me return to the performances for a moment and to a specific scene that I want to use as a lens for discussing what these actors are actually doing at the level of craft. Because I think the best way to understand great acting is not to describe it abstractly, but to isolate a specific moment and ask, what is happening here exactly and why does it work? The scene I want to use is one that takes place fairly early in the film's second act, a scene in which Clarice, having made some progress in her investigation and having established a slightly more solidified basis for her exchanges with Lecter, arrives at the facility carrying new information and a new urgency. The specific circumstances of this scene are something I will hold back from fully detailing until we are in spoiler territory, but the essential dynamic is this. She is asking for more, and she is asking from a position of slightly greater leverage than she has previously had, and Lecter is assessing this shift in the balance of their exchange with the particular quality of attention he brings to anything that represents the change in a situation he has been observing. What Hawkins does in this scene, and I want to be as precise as I can about this because the precision matters, is something that I would describe as active reception. He is not performing engagement. He is not signaling that he is interested in the way that actors sometimes signal emotions rather than inhabit them. He is genuinely, visibly, moment by moment processing what Foster is bringing to the scene and responding to it in real time. You can watch his eyes in this scene and see something happening behind them, not a pre-planned series of reactions, but a genuine continuous assessment, as though the character is actually doing what the character is supposed to be doing, reading her, reading the shifts in her cadence, the places where her composure tightens and the places where it releases, the information she is giving him that she does not know she is giving him. All of this is visible in Hopkins' eyes in this scene if you watch for it. And what makes it so extraordinary is that it is not a showy performance choice. It is not something the actor is doing to draw attention to his craft. It is the opposite. It is an act of complete subordination to the reality of the scene, a decision to actually be present and actually receive and actually respond, rather than to perform being present and receiving and responding. That distinction between genuine presence and performed presence is the line between adequate acting and great acting. Hopkins is on the right side of that line in every scene he is in. Foster's work in the same scene operates in a completely different but equally fascinating register. Where Hopkins is all reception and assessment, Foster is all management. The continuous, exhausting, microscopically precise management of what she reveals and what she withholds, what she allows him to see and what she keeps protected. And what makes her performance so remarkable in this specific scene is the way you can feel the management costing her something. It is not effortless. The composure is real, but it is maintained at a price, and occasionally, in a flicker of expression, a fractional change in the quality of her breathing, a moment where the management slips by a degree so small that only Lecter and the camera would catch it, you see what is underneath the composure. Not fear exactly, something more complicated than fear. Something that is aware of the exact nature of what this situation is and what it requires and what it costs, and that is continuously deciding that the cost is worth it. That continuous deciding, that moment by moment recommitment to being in this room, to being this exposed, to continuing to pay whatever this costs, is the interior life of the performance. And it is always there, in every moment of every scene, even the ones where the surface is perfectly calm, perhaps especially those. I want to talk about the screenplay in some depth, because Ted Tully's adaptation of the Harris novel is a piece of craft that I think represents one of the underappreciated achievements in this film's very celebrated achievement list. Adaptations of novels are, in their nature, a process of reduction and selection, of deciding what to keep, what to condense, what to discard, and what to restructure in order to make a story that works on its own terms in a new medium with its own requirements. And what Tully managed with this adaptation, reportedly through a process that involved close collaboration with Demi and with Foster, and that went through multiple drafts before arriving at the shooting script, is to take a novel that operates on two distinct registers simultaneously and find a way to honor both registers in the compressed, externalized medium of film. The novel, like most good crime fiction, has an interior dimension, the private experience of its protagonist, the running commentary of her observation and analysis and feeling that a screenplay cannot directly reproduce and must find structural and visual equivalents for. Tully found those equivalents by trusting, to an unusual degree for the genre, the capacity of performance and direction to carry interior information that the dialogue could not state. The script gives Foster relatively few moments of explicit self-expression, relatively few scenes in which Clarice states directly what she is feeling or thinking. What the script gives her instead are scenes in which she acts and reacts, in which her choices and responses carry the information about her interior life that the dialogue is not narrating. This is, in former terms, a more demanding and more sophisticated approach to character development than the more conventional method of giving a protagonist scenes in which they explicitly articulate their psychology. It requires more from the actor, more from the director, and more from the viewer. It also produces, when it works, something that feels less like a constructed character and more like a real person, because real people do not narrate their entire lives in dialogue. They act and react and choose, and you understand who they are through the texture of those choices rather than through their explicit self-description. The structure of the screenplay, the alternation between the Clarice and Lecter scenes and the investigation scenes, is managed with a rhythmic intelligence that serves the material's dual nature. Talley understood that the Lecter scenes needed a specific kind of pacing, a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness that was the opposite of conventional thriller rhythm, and that the investigation scenes needed the forward momentum of a real procedural thriller, and that these two rhythms needed to coexist without cancelling each other out. The way he manages this in the script is through careful attention to where the scenes end and where they begin, through the specific emotional note on which each lecture scene closes, and the specific kind of energy with which the following investigation scene opens. These transitions are not jarring, they are calibrated. Each scene leaves you in a specific emotional state, and the scene that follows acknowledges that state not by dwelling on it, but by building from it. That calibration is one of the hardest things to achieve in screenplay structure, and it is one of the things that makes the script for this film feel, in its best passages, genuinely seamless. There are also specific moments of writing in this screenplay that I want to highlight as examples of what great adaptation can do. Moments where Tali takes something from the novel and renders it in a form that the film medium can carry with a force that the prose original could not quite match. The scene in which Clarice first fully describes her central childhood memory to Lecter, the memory that gives the film its title, the memory of the lamps that forms the emotional core of her character, is one of these moments. In the novel, this memory is rendered with a novelist's access to interiority, with the texture of record sensation and the layering of retrospective meaning that prose can achieve. In the film, it is rendered entirely through dialogue and close up through what Foster says and how she says it, and what Hawkins' face does while he listens. The compression is enormous. What the novelist took pages to render, Tully gives you in a few minutes of exchange. And yet the emotional impact of the scene in the film is, by most accounts, at least equal to the equivalent passage in the novel. What Tully understood is that the compression of film, the fact that images and performance can carry meaning with an immediacy that prose cannot quite match, means that you do not always need to expand material in order to honor it. Sometimes the most faithful adaptation is the most compressed one, because compression in film is not reduction, it is intensification. It is what happens when you put enormous meaning into very small containers and let the medium do the work. I want to address for a moment the physical filmmaking of the production, the specifics of location and set construction, because there are choices made here that have consequences for the experience of watching the film that are not always recognized as the choices they are. The film used real locations for much of Clarice's work, the grounds and corridors of the actual FBI Academy at Quantico for the training sequences, real external locations for the field investigation passages, real cities for the procedural scenes. Demem made this choice reportedly because he wanted Clarice's world to feel real, to have the specific texture of actual places rather than the slightly abstract, controlled quality of constructed environments. He wanted the weight of reality to be present in the images, and it is the institutional spaces in this film feel genuinely institutional in a way that many film productions cannot quite achieve on sets. They have the specific quality of light and proportion and accumulated use that real buildings have, the quality that tells you this space exists independently of any story being told in it, that people move through it every day for purposes that have nothing to do with cinema. Lecter's world, by contrast, is entirely constructed. The cell, the corridor, the facility, all of it built on sound stages, all of it designed rather than found. And here is what that contrast between found and constructed space does to the experience of the film. It makes Clarice's world feel contingent, and Lecter's world feel absolute. Her world is the real world, with all the accidental texture and imperfection of the real world. His world is a designed world, a world built to specific proportions for a specific purpose, in which every element serves a function and nothing is accidental. The contrast between these two spatial registers is, I think, part of what gives the Lecter scenes their particular quality of unreality. Not the unreality of something fake, but the unreality of something too precisely itself, too perfectly what it needs to be, as though the space were somehow cooperating with the occupant, as though it had been built for him rather than simply around him, which of course it was, and which he knows, and which you feel. Now, there is a casting story connected to the secondary antagonist of this film, the figure known as Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, that I want to address, because it is both fascinating as production history and important for understanding the film's most significant ethical fault line. The casting of this role required finding a performer capable of inhabiting an extremely difficult psychological and physical space, a character whose disturbance runs very deep and whose presence in the film must generate genuine dread without stepping into cheap caricature. Levine's work in the role is technically and physically extraordinary, a performance that operates in a completely different register from everything else in the film, existing in a space that is simultaneously pathetic and dangerous, ordinary and terrifyingly strange. He brings to the role a physical specificity and the psychological commitment that are unmistakable and genuine. And yet, as I noted earlier in this essay, the character he is inhabiting and the choices the film makes about how to frame and present that character sits at the center of the film's most serious ethical problem. The proximity that the screenplay creates between Bill's psychology and questions of gender identity is something the film both invokes and then attempts to disclaim, and that attempted disclaimer does not, in my view, fully succeed. I want to return to this in more detail when we discuss what the film is really saying, because I think it is a genuine wound in the material, not a surface imperfection, but something that goes closer to the center of what the film believes and what it is asking you to believe. Let me tell you a fifth thing about this production, something that I find fascinating not as trivia but as a genuine window into the quality of attention that Demi brought to every element of this film. Throughout the production, Demi reportedly insisted on a kind of sustained emotional attentiveness to Clarice's experience that went beyond conventional character work. He had lengthy conversations with Foster, according to accounts of the production, not primarily about technique or performance choices, but about what it feels like to be this person in this world, what the specific quality of her experience in each environment actually is, at the level of sensation and emotion before it is translated into performance. He wanted reportedly for the film to be built from the inside of her experience outward rather than from the outside inward. He wanted every camera placement, every lighting choice, every edit to be asking first, what is this doing to Clarice? What is she feeling in this moment? How does this environment enter her? And only after answering those questions, only after building that interior architecture, to ask, how do we show it? That orientation, that commitment to building from the inside out, is why the film has the quality it has in its best passages. It is why the institutional spaces feel the way they feel rather than simply look the way they look. It is why the lecture side generates the specific kind of discomfort it generates. It is why Foster's presence in the film carries the specific quality of weight and interiority that it carries. All of it flows from that one foundational decision: this is Clarice's film, and we will see everything through the quality of her experience. The decision was not Demi's alone. It was arrived at in collaboration with Foster and with Tally and with the entire creative team. But it was Demi's job to hold it steady throughout the production and to make sure that every department, every collaborator, every decision maker on set was working from the same foundational commitment. That it holds that the film's orientation toward Clarice's experience does not waver even in its weaker passages is a directorial achievement that goes beyond technical competence. It is the achievement of a sustained artistic vision, maintained across months of production under all the pressures and compromises that film production inevitably generates. That is one of the hardest things a director can do, and Demi did it. Now let me speak about what this film actually achieves, not in terms of cultural impact or awards recognition, both of which we have already addressed, but in terms of the specific things it accomplishes as a piece of art, as an experience, as a film that does things that other films cannot quite do, or will not quite do, or have not found a specific combination of elements to do in quite this way. Because I think it is important, before I turn to an honest assessment of the film's genuine shortcomings, to be specific and clear about its genuine achievements, not as a balancing exercise, not as a way of softening the criticism to come, but because the achievements and the shortcomings are, in this particular film, often adjacent to each other, often produced by the same choices, and understanding the achievements clearly is what makes the shortcomings meaningful rather than simply negative. The first and most important achievement of this film, the one that everything else depends on, is the creation of a genuinely complex and genuinely specific female protagonist at the center of a genre that had historically marginalized, simplified, or victimized its female characters. Clarice Starling is not a type. She is not a variation on a pre-existing template. She is a specific person with a specific history, specific fears, specific capabilities, and specific limitations, specific reasons for being who she is and wanting what she wants, and the film treats her specificity with complete seriousness throughout. This matters more than it might initially seem because the genre she is inhabiting, the psychological thriller, the serial killer procedural, had by 1991 accumulated a very particular tradition of female characters. The endangered woman, the victim whose peril drives the plot, the love interest whose function is to provide motivation for the male protagonist, the professional woman whose competence is undercut at some point by vulnerability that male characters are not asked to demonstrate. Clarice does not fit any of these templates. She is the protagonist, not the prize. The plot is driven by her intelligence and her choices, not by her peril, her vulnerability, and she is genuinely vulnerable in specific and honest ways, is not a source of weakness but of complexity, and the film never uses it to diminish her or to redirect attention toward a more conventionally heroic figure. She is in every scene the most important person in the room, and the film never apologizes for that, never hedges, never pulls back. That commitment to a specific, complex, fully realized female protagonist maintained throughout an entire film in a genre that had never quite managed it before is a genuine achievement and a significant one. The second achievement I want to name is the portrayal of Lecter, not simply as an iconic villain, which is how the culture has processed him, but as a genuinely complex philosophical figure whose complexity is not in tension with his monstrousness but is part of it. What the film understands about Lecter, what Hopkins understands about him, what Demi understood about framing him, is that his intelligence is not a redeeming quality. It is not something that mitigates the horror of what he is and what he has done. It is, in fact, the thing that makes him most disturbing. Because what his intelligence demonstrates is the possibility of a human being who has all the cognitive equipment for moral reasoning and who simply chooses, with complete deliberateness and complete clarity, not to apply it. He is not a monster because he cannot understand the difference between right and wrong. He is a monster because he understands it completely and finds it unpersuasive. That is a more frightening portrait of evil than almost any other the cinema has produced, and the film, through the specific quality of Hopkins' performance, through the way the camera presents him, through the specific nature of the exchanges the screenplay gives him, sustains that portrait without simplifying it, without pulling back from what it implies, without giving you the relief of a reductive explanation. The third achievement is one that I have already touched on in discussing the screenplay, but that I want to name explicitly because I think it is the film's most undervalued quality, its treatment of institutional space as a form of psychological experience. The way Demi renders every environment Clarice moves through as a record of what that environment does to her, rather than simply as a location for the story to occur in, elevates the film from a genre exercise into something genuinely analytical, something that is trying to understand, not just portray, the specific experience of a particular kind of person navigating a particular kind of world. The FBI Academy, the detention facility, the field locations, all of them rendered as neutral backdrops but as active participants in the story, environments that push on Clarice and that she must push back against, that cost her something simply to inhabit, that she navigates with a specific and practiced efficiency that speaks volumes about the life she has lived before the story began. This is how great filmmaking works. Not by telling you things, but by building environments that you feel before you understand, that enter your nervous system directly and give you information that words could never quite convey. Demi's construction of Clarice's world does this with a consistency and a precision that I find genuinely admirable, even in passages of the film that I find less successful in other respects. The fourth achievement belongs entirely to Foster and to the single scene that, for me, proved the total quality of her work in this role. It is a scene, late in the film in a context that I will discuss in full in the spoiler section, in which Clarice is required to contain an emotion that is among the most difficult emotions for a human being to contain. A moment where she has encountered something that has broken through all of the professional composure, all of the managed exposure, or of the deliberate vulnerability calibrated to serve a purpose, and where what she is feeling is not useful, not purposeful, not in the service of anything except the simple enormous fact of being a person in a situation that demands more than any professional training can prepare you for. Foster in this scene does something that I've rewatched multiple times and each time found more extraordinary. She contains it. She does not suppress it. Suppression would be visible, would leave a trace of rigidity and over control in the performance. She contains it. She holds it with the specific quality of someone who has spent a lifetime learning how to keep the most important things safe by keeping them held. The face does not go blank, the eyes do not go flat. What you see in them is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling so large that the performance has to be that much more still in order to hold it. It is one of the finest pieces of film acting I have seen, and it is over in seconds. The film barely stops for it, but it is there, and if you are watching the right way, it is devastating. The fifth achievement, and this one is harder to articulate but no less real, is the film's treatment of the relationship between intelligence and power. What this film understands at a level that I do not think has been fully articulated in most discussions of it is that intelligence in the absence of institutional power is a different thing from intelligence in the presence of it. Clarice's intelligence, and she is genuinely, evidently, exceptionally intelligent, exists throughout this film in a condition of significant structural powerlessness. She is a trainee. She does not have the authority to act independently. She does not have the standing to make demands. She must make requests, must negotiate, must work within and around a system of permissions and hierarchies that she did not design and that does not particularly accommodate her. Lecter's intelligence exists in a condition of radical structural powerlessness. He is a prisoner, after all, with no formal authority over anything. But the film understands that there are different kinds of power and that the hierarchies of institutional authority are not the only hierarchies in operation in any given room. Lecter, in spite of his absolute physical containment, has a kind of power that Clarice's superiors, for all their institutional authority, cannot touch. It is the power of pure perception, of seeing so clearly and so completely that the people around you become, in a meaningful sense, transparent. And the film's most sophisticated observation is that this power, the power of perception, of understanding, of genuine intellectual penetration, is one that Clarice also possesses in a less fully developed but no less genuine form, and that it is precisely this quality that Lecter recognizes in her. But the connection between them, the strange, asymmetrical, genuinely felt connection that gives the film its emotional center, is a connection between two people who experience the world primarily through a quality of perception that most people around them do not share. That is, I think, the film's truest insight, and it is delivered entirely through the texture of performance and visual drama without a single word of explicit statement. Cinema rarely does this kind of subterranean thematic work this effectively. When it does, it is worth naming. There is one more thing I want to say about what this film achieves, before we turn to what it falls short of. And it is something that I think only becomes fully visible when you watch the film multiple times, when you have already absorbed the story and the plot mechanics no longer require your attention, and you can watch the film purely as an experience of image and performance and rhythm. What you see watching it this way is a film that has been constructed with extraordinary care at the level of small detail. The kind of care that you can feel in a film even when you cannot always identify its specific source. The care that comes from everyone working at maximum attention, from the most prominent performer to the most junior crew member, because the project they are all serving has created the conditions for that kind of collective investment. Films that achieve this quality are rare. They have a specific texture, a density of purposefulness, a sense that nothing in the frame is accidental, that every choice has been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why, that is immediately recognizable once you have learned to feel for it, and that is immediately absent when you have not felt it for a while. The Silence of the Lambs, in its finest passages, has this texture. It has been made by people cared, completely, seriously, without reservation. whatever else I am about to say about where it falls short, that quality of collective care is real, and it is permanent, and it is part of what the film will always be. And now I want to be honest with you, genuinely, carefully, without the kind of vagueness that passes for criticism when a critic does not have the courage to be specific. Because I think one of the responsibilities of anyone who takes cinema seriously, who treats it as art rather than entertainment, who believes that what films do to us and what they ask of us actually matters, is to be willing to name what does not work with the same precision and the same care that they bring to naming what does. Admiration that cannot survive honest scrutiny is not admiration, it is deference. And deference to reputation, however distinguished, is the opposite of the kind of engagement this channel exists to practice. So let me tell you where this film falls short. Let me tell you where it reaches and does not quite arrive. And let me try to be specific about whether each shortcoming is a surface imperfection, the kind of roughness that is sometimes inseparable from genuine ambition, or something that goes deeper into the architecture of the film itself. The first and most serious problem, and the one I have been circling throughout this essay without fully addressing, is the film's treatment of its secondary antagonist. The figure known to investigators as Buffalo Bill is the film's active danger. The killer, who is operating in present time, whose current victim establishes the urgency that drives Clarice into her exchanges with Lecter. And the portrait the film offers of this character contains a cluster of choices that I find genuinely troubling in ways that go beyond contemporary sensitivity, in ways that I think represent a real failure of artistic clarity and moral precision, regardless of the era in which the film was made. Here is the specific problem. The film invokes repeatedly and deliberately a connection between this character's psychology and questions of gender identity, between his violence and his desire to literally occupy a different body, a different skin. The screenplay explicitly introduces a character who offers a psychological disclaimer, a line in which a professional voice states that the character is not, clinically speaking, a transgender individual, and that his fixation on occupying another body is a product of a different psychological structure entirely, rooted in self-hatred rather than in genuine gender identity. The disclaimer is present, it is clearly intentional, and it does not work. It does not work because the disclaimer is not a portrait. Saying the thing is not true does not undo the connection. The film has spent considerable screen time building. It does not undo the visual language of the character's scenes in his own environment. The specific images the film chooses to show you about how he occupies his private space. The specific ways the film renders his relationship to the female body he is obsessed with. The disclaimer tells you what to think. The images have already told you something different. And in cinema, images are always more powerful than statements. Always. What makes this a genuine artistic failure rather than merely a political one, and I want to be clear about this distinction because I think it matters, is that the film is making in other areas of its work such sophisticated use of the gap between what is stated and what is shown. The entire architecture of the Lecter relationship depends on the film's understanding that what is not said is often more important than what is, that what is implied by an image can carry more truth than what is asserted in dialogue. And yet, in the handling of Bill, the film abandons that sophistication entirely and falls back on the bluntest possible tool, the spoken disclaimer, offered as though the viewer's intelligence can be managed through simple assertion. The film does not trust its audience in this one area in the way it trusts them everywhere else, and that failure of trust produces a failure of craft. And that failure of craft produces a portrait that, whatever the intentions behind it, contributes to a conflation between violence and gender nonconformity that real people have paid real prices for. That is not a small thing. That is not something that can be fully redeemed by the sophistication of the film's other achievements. I want to be fair about this, because fairness is important. I do not think the film was made with malicious intent. I think it was made by people who believed genuinely and perhaps sincerely that the disclaimer was sufficient, that the sophistication of the psychological portrait they were constructing would prevent the kind of reduction they were nominally arguing against. They were wrong. And the wrongness is not theirs alone. It is shared by a cultural moment that had not yet developed the critical tools to fully recognize what this kind of portrayal does in the absence of other representations to counterbalance it. But shared wrongness is still wrongness, and the fact that 1991 lacked the critical vocabulary to fully articulate the problem does not mean the problem was not there. It was there. It is there now. It is one of the things that sits for me at the center of my complicated relationship with this film. The second significant problem is one of tonal management, specifically the film's inability to fully integrate the temperature of the Bill scenes with the temperature of the rest of the film. I described earlier the film's sophisticated operation of two distinct narrative temperatures, the cold precision of the Lecter scenes and the procedural urgency of the investigation. But the Bill scenes operate at a third temperature that the film never fully succeeds in harmonizing with either of the other two. They are louder, more viscerally disturbing, more conventionally horrific in their imagery and atmosphere than anything else in the film. They belong in some fundamental way to a different film, to a more straightforward genre horror picture that is less interested in psychological complexity and more interested in generating the specific kind of reversion that comes from direct confrontation with disturbed behavior. When the film cuts to these scenes from the precision of the Lecter exchanges, the tonal shift is jarring in ways that feel less like deliberate contrast and more like a failure to fully unify the visual and emotional language of the whole. You feel in those moments the seam in the construction, and a film this carefully made should not have visible seams. The third problem is pacing, and I want to be specific about where the pacing breaks down and what the breakdown costs. The film's second act, the middle portion of the investigation before the structural pivot I described in the previous section, has passages that run significantly slower than the material requires. Not the Lecter scenes, which have their own internal justification for their deliberate pace, but the purely procedural passages, the accumulation of investigative detail, the institutional conversations, the movement from one piece of evidence to the next. These passages are, in several stretches, simply too long. The rhythm that Demi has established in the film's first act, the careful, considered tempo that is slow enough to feel the weight of things but fast enough to maintain genuine forward momentum, begins to slip in these middle sections, and the slippage, while never catastrophic, is noticeable enough to cost the film something. It costs you investment. It creates a distance between you and the story at precisely the moment when the story most needs your engagement in order to make the eventual pivot feel as urgent and as earned as it should. When the film does arrive at that pivot, when the investigation snaps into focus and the urgency becomes genuinely immediate, the effect is powerful. But it would have been more powerful if the slippage had not occurred, if the middle had maintained the momentum of the first act. The transition from patience to urgency would have felt less like relief and more like the activation of something that had been building continuously rather than intermittently. There is also, I think, a problem with the film's treatment of Clarice's relationships with the male institutional figures around her. I noted earlier that the film's rendering of the ambient fiction she exposes, the low level but continuous experience of being assessed and managed, and slightly diminished by the institutional world she is trying to navigate, is one of its most perceptive and most honest achievements. But the film, having established that fiction with great clarity and precision, does not always follow through on what that fiction should cost. There are moments where the film seems to want to have it both ways, to acknowledge the reality of the power differential and the specific kind of difficulty it creates for Clarice, while also maintaining a version of these male authority figures that is not quite as damaging or as aware of its own power as the film's honest portrait of the environment would seem to require. The result is a slight incoherence, not in the portrait of Clarice, which is always precise and always honest, but in the portrait of the institutional world around her, which occasionally softens at the edges in ways that the film's own logic does not fully support. And then there is the question of Doug Levin's performance, which I want to address with care because I genuinely believe it is both remarkable and problematic in ways that are deeply entangled with each other. What Levin does in the role is technically extraordinary, The physical specificity, the vocal choices, the quality of psychological disturbance he brings to every scene in that basement, all of it represents genuine craft and genuine commitment. But a performance like the character exists in a register so far outside the psychological realism that governs the rest of the film that it creates a specific kind of dissonance that the film never resolves. Lecter is disturbing because he is extraordinarily human, because his monstrousness is not a departure from humanity but a specific and extreme expression of it. Bill is disturbing because he seems to have departed from humanity entirely, because the film renders him as something so alien and so incomprehensible that you never quite feel you are watching a person. You feel you are watching a symbol of something, a vessel for the film's horror ambitions, a figure whose function is to generate dread rather than to be understood. And that is, I think, a failure of moral imagination that sits alongside the tonal problem I described earlier. The film that made Lecter so comprehensively, so disturbingly human, chose not to extend the same quality of imagination to its other murderer. The consequences of that choice ripple outward in ways that continue to matter. Let me also say something about the film's ending, not in full detail, which I am reserving for the spoiler section, but about its emotional register, which I can address without revealing narrative specifics. The ending constructed as a kind of triumphant resolution, a closing of the circle that the film opened with its very first image of Clarice running through that grey forest towards something she was not yet permitted to reach. And on the terms it has set for itself, it delivers that resolution with genuine emotional impact. But, and this is a significant but, the resolution comes at a price that the film in its final moments does not fully account for. There is something that Clarice has given away during the course of this story, something about herself, something about the specific quality of her interior life that made her special and that Lecter found so fascinating, that the film's triumphant ending does not fully address. Something has been used, something has been spent, and the film, in its final gesture, seems to want to celebrate what has been achieved without sitting, even briefly, with what has been paid. That refusal to account for the cost, that preference for the clean resolution over the complicated truth, is the film's final and perhaps most significant artistic compromise. It chooses satisfaction over honesty at the one moment when honesty was most required. These are real problems. They are not minor texture. Several of them, the handling of Bill, the tonal inconsistency those scenes create, the failure to fully account for what the ending cost, are genuine wounds in the material. They do not make the film's achievements disappear, but they do prevent it from being the unqualified masterpiece that its cultural reputation claims it to be. And they are, I think, part of why my personal experience of this film sits where it sits, why I find it impossible to simply celebrate and equally impossible to simply dismiss. Now, now I want to go somewhere different. I want to step away from the question of what the film gets wrong and ask what it is actually about, not what it says it is about, not what the genre conventions it operates within would suggest it is about, but what it is really saying at the level of feeling, of implication, of the things that hover in the spaces between the words and the images, and that you feel before you can name them. Here is what I keep returning to. At its deepest level, this film is not about a serial killer. It is not about the FBI or the procedural mechanics of criminal investigation. It is not even primarily about the famous dynamic between its two central figures, as extraordinary as that dynamic is. At its deepest level, this film is about what it costs to truly see, what it costs to be the kind of person who perceives the world with genuine clarity, who looks at another human being and understands them fully, without the protective distortions and comfortable illusions that most of us rely on to make the encounter with other people bearable. That kind of seeing is a gift, and it is also a weight. It is something that cannot be turned off, something that operates continuously, regardless of whether the world it is directed at is safe or beautiful or kind. And the film is asking, with genuine seriousness, what kind of person can sustain that quality of perception without being destroyed by it? What it costs to look clearly at darkness and continue, whether the looking changes you, whether something is always inevitably lost in the transaction. Think about Clarice in these terms. Her exceptional quality, the thing that Lecter recognizes and that the film consistently validates, is precisely this capacity for genuine perception. She looks at the people around her and sees them clearly. She looks at victims and sees them as people rather than as evidence. She looks at Lecter and refuses the comfortable reduction of him to pure monster, because the comfortable reduction, however much it might protect her, would prevent her from understanding what she needs to understand. This clarity is her professional gift and her human burden simultaneously. It is what makes her good at what she does and what makes what she does cost her. Every time she enters that cell and makes herself genuinely available to Lecter's perception, every time she trades her own privacy, her own interior history, her own protected self, she is paying the specific price that genuine seeing always extracts. She is giving away pieces of herself in exchange for pieces of truth. And here is what this film understands about that exchange, which is the thing I find most genuinely profound in it. The exchange is never equal. The truth you receive is never worth exactly what you gave for it. You pay more, always. Not because you are being cheated, but because truth is simply more expensive than comfort, and the gap between what it cost and what you were prepared to spend is an inescapable feature of any genuine encounter with reality. Clarice pays for every piece of insight she receives from Lecter, and what she pays is not just time or professional risk or the discomfort of being seen. She pays with a particular quality of selfhood that Lecter finds so rare and so valuable, with access to those protected interior places that she has spent her life keeping safe. She opens those places one by one because the case demands it, and the film never quite tells you whether she gets them back when the case is over, whether what was opened can be fully closed again. That ambiguity, that refusal to assure you that the transaction left her intact, is the film's most honest and most haunting quality. The recurring motif of sound in this film, and this is one of those elements that operates below the threshold of conscious attention for most viewers, but that shapes your experience of the film profoundly, is another way into what the film is really saying. The title itself is a sound, or rather an absence of sound, the silence of the lamps. And throughout the film, what is absent is often more present than what is there. The silence in the Lecter scenes, which I discussed in terms of Shore's score, is not just a musical choice, it is a thematic statement. This is a film about listening, about the specific quality of attention required to hear what is not being said, to read the world through its absences rather than its presences. Clarice is, above all things, a listener. She listens to Lecter with a quality of focused, almost physical attention that she cannot give to anyone else in her institutional world, because no one else in her institutional world is offering her information she cannot get any other way. The silence between their exchanges, the specific quality of the pauses, the way each of them processes what the other has said before responding, is where the most important communication in the film actually occurs, not in the words, in the silence around the words. Cinema rarely does this, treats silence as a positive active presence rather than simply the absence of sound. This film does it better than almost any other. There is also something the film is saying about the way we construct meaning from suffering, about the human tendency to narrativize painful experience, to turn it into a story that can be told and thereby managed and thereby survive. Clarice's central private memory, the one she eventually shares with Lecter, the one that gives the film its title, is not simply a biographical detail about her past. It is the specific narrative she has built around the defining experience of her childhood, the experience of loss and helplessness that she has spent her entire adult life trying to answer. The story she tells about the lamps is the story she tells herself about why she does what she does, about why she runs toward the thing that frightens her rather than away from it, about why she cannot look away from suffering even when looking away would protect her. The memory is not just memory, it is a myth of self, a story she has told herself so many times, with such clarity and such feeling that it has become indistinguishable from identity. And in giving that story to Lecter, in allowing him access to the specific narrative that holds her together, she is doing something far more intimate and far more dangerous than sharing a biographical fact. She is handing him the structure key to who she is, the map of her interior life. And the film, in the specific way it handles this moment, in the specific quality of quiet attention that Hopkins gives to listening to her tell this story, understands exactly how significant that offering is and exactly what it means for everything that follows. The symbols in this film are not difficult to read, they are not hidden. The moths, the specimens in the laboratory, the imagery that recurs in the investigation, are operating as a fairly legible metaphor for transformation, for the process of becoming something different from what you were, for the specific violence and vulnerability of the moment when one form of self is shed and another has not yet fully emerged. The film does not particularly disguise this symbolism or ask you to work hard to arrive at it. What is more interesting is the specific way the film positions different characters in relation to this imagery. Lecter, who has understood transformation, who has in some sense already completed a version of it, regards the moths with something that looks in his scenes like aesthetic appreciation. They interest him the way beautiful things interest him. Bill, who is obsessed with transformation, regards them with something much more desperate and much more personal. And Clarice, who is in the middle of her own transformation, who is becoming something she was not when the film began, does not engage with the moths directly at all. She is too busy being transformed to observe the symbol of it, which is, when you think about it, exactly right. The people in the middle of their own change never see themselves clearly. That clarity belongs to those watching from outside. The film is also saying something about mentorship, about the strange, morally complicated, often deeply asymmetrical relationships between people who have knowledge and people who need it. Every authority figure in Clarice's life in this film is extracting something from her in exchange for whatever they offer. Her supervisor sends her into a situation she is not equipped for because he needs something from Lecter that she is uniquely positioned to obtain. The facility director uses her as a chess piece in his ongoing management of his most famous prisoner. And Lecter, the most honest about the transactional nature of what they are doing, in his way, asks her explicitly and directly for what he wants in exchange for what she needs. There is a direct irony in this. The monster is the one who is transparent about the terms. The institutions that are supposed to be on her side are the ones who dress their extractions in the language of opportunity and professional development and ask her to be grateful for the chance to be used. The film knows this. It builds this knowledge into every institutional scene. And it does not offer her a version of authority that is genuinely trustworthy, genuinely on her side, genuinely invested in her welfare rather than her utility. The closest thing she has to that, the closest thing the film offers her to a genuine mentor, someone who sees her clearly and invests in her growth for reasons that are partly selfless, is the monster behind the glass. And the film does not flinch from that, does not apologize for it, does not resolve it into something more comfortable. It holds the paradox and lets it breathe. What does all of this mean about human experience in a broader sense? What is the film reaching toward at its most ambitious when it puts all of these elements together? I think it is reaching toward something like this: the capacity to understand genuinely, fully, without comfortable simplification, is inseparable from the capacity to suffer. To see clearly is to be permeable. To be permeable is to be changed by what you see. And to be changed by what you see is to pay a price that you cannot fully anticipate in advance and cannot fully recover in retrospect. The film is asking whether that price is worth it, whether the understanding you gain justifies the self you spent in gaining it. And it answers that question ultimately in the affirmative, but not easily, not cleanly, not without leaving the weight of the cost visible on the screen. That cost is what Jodie Foster's performance carries. That cost is what the grey light of those institutional corridors expresses. That cost is what the silence in the Lecter scenes contains. And it is why the film, for all its shortcomings and for all the genuine problems I have outlined, continues to matter, continues to demand to be seen, continues to generate the kind of serious and comfortable, productive conversation that only art that is genuinely reaching for something important can produce. Now, the question of whether this film belongs to a larger story, whether its place in a franchise changes how we should understand it as a standalone work, is something I want to address with both care and honesty, because the relationship between this film and what came before and after it is more illuminating than it might initially seem. Thomas Harris had introduced Hannibal Lecter in Red Dragon, his 1981 novel, which had been adapted for the screen as Manhunter in 1986, 5 years before this film arrived. The Lecter of Manhunter, as rendered by Brian Cox, is a different creature. Not a worse one necessarily, but a different one. More clinical, more procedural in his menace, less baroque in his intelligence. And the Manhunter adaptation itself is, I think, a genuinely remarkable piece of filmmaking. Michael Mann's cool, electronic, visually precise thriller sensibility applied to this material produced something that operates at a completely different temperature from the demi-film, but that has its own specific power. When you watch Manhunter with knowledge of what would come later, you see the shape of what Harris had created, the specific quality of the Lecter figure, the specific dynamic between investigator and monster, and you understand that what Damian Hopkins did with it was not a discovery of something new, but an intensification of something that was already there, waiting for the specific combination of elements that would allow it to fully emerge. The Silence of the Lambs stands as the fullest and most achieved expression of the central dynamic Harris had been developing. It is not a sequel in the conventional sense. It can be watched and fully understood without knowledge of Red Dragon or Manhunter, and most people who encountered it did exactly that. But knowing what came before deepens the experience. It shows you that Lecter has a history that precedes this film, a history that has shaped him, and that is visible in the specific way Hopkins inhabits the character, in the quality of someone who has had considerable time to refine his understanding of himself and his situation. What came after Hannibal in 2001, Red Dragon revisited in 2002 as a direct sequel to this film, and the subsequent iterations of the franchise, including the extraordinary television series, tells a different and more complicated story. Ridley Scott's Hannibal extended the mythology in directions that were visually spectacular and emotionally unsatisfying. A film that took the character into territory that the delicate moral architecture of this film had deliberately avoided, that made explicit what this film had wisely kept ambiguous. It is more operatic and less humane than its predecessor, and the operatic excess, while often visually arresting, comes at the cost of the specific quality of psychological realism that made this film's central relationship so compelling. The franchise, in its various subsequent iterations, has sometimes demonstrated that what made this film extraordinary was not simply the character of Lecter, but the specific relationship between Lecter and Clarice, that specific dynamic with those specific performers in that specific configuration. Remove any element of that configuration, and you have something different, sometimes considerably lesser. The television incarnation, Hannibal, the Brian Fuller series that ran from 2013 to 2015, is in its own right a genuinely major achievement in the larger story of this mythology. Fuller found a completely different approach to the material, more aesthetically extreme, more psychologically baroque, more openly literary in its references and its self-consciousness. It is in many respects a better sustained piece of work than any of the film's sequels. It demonstrates that the material has genuine depth and genuine flexibility, that it can sustain multiple different artistic approaches, multiple different registers, without exhausting itself. And it demonstrates, by contrast, how specifically and precisely Demi-film is calibrated to its particular approach. The Fuller series is everything turned up. The Demi-film is everything held back. And the holding back, the deliberate restraint, the refusal of excess, the commitment to specific psychological temperature is what gives the film its particular kind of permanent power. Where does this film stand in the larger story of this mythology? I think it stands as the essential work, the necessary one, the one against which everything else in this franchise is measured, whether the measuring is conscious or not. It is not the most visually elaborate, it is not the most emotionally extreme, it is not the most ambitious in terms of what it is willing to put on screen, but it is the most humanly true. It is the version of this material in which the human stakes, the specific human cost of what these characters are doing to each other and to themselves, are rendered with the greatest clarity and the greatest care. And human truth, in a mythology this concerned with the extremes of human psychology, is the hardest thing to achieve and the most important thing to get right. Does it deepen or repeat what came before? It deepens, profoundly and irreversibly. The lecture of Manhunter is already remarkable. The lecture of this film is something else entirely, something that operates at a different altitude of human complexity, that asks more from its audience and gives more in return, that has been constructed with such care and such intelligence that it changed permanently what we thought this character could be and what this kind of story could do. And does it shape what came next? Yes, everything that came next is shaped by it. Some of what came next tried to replicate its specific qualities and failed, because those qualities are not replicable. They emerged from a specific convergence that cannot be reproduced deliberately. Some of what came next tried to find a different register entirely, with varying degrees of success, but all of it exists in relationship to this film. All of it is oriented in one way or another by where this film landed and what it established as the standard. That is what it means to make the essential work in a mythology. Not necessarily the best work in an absolute sense, though it may be that too, but the one that sets the coordinates, the one that defines the territory that everything else must navigate. And that is where I want to leave this section, with the film understood not only as itself but as the center of a larger conversation, as the work that more than any other single entry in this mythology demonstrated what the material is actually capable of when the right combination of intelligence and care and genuine artistic ambition is brought to it, whatever its shortcomings. And they are real, and they matter. This is the film that proved what was possible here. That proof is permanent. It does not expire with the fashion of any particular era or the shifting of any particular conversation. It sits in the record, in the images, in the performances as evidence of what cinema can do when it takes its responsibility seriously enough. With institutional confidence, represents the most probable location of Buffalo Bill and his current victim. The FBI assembles. The operation is authorized, and at the exact moment that the institutional machinery, the full weight of federal authority, the helicopters and the tactical teams and the senior agents descends on that location, Clarice is somewhere else entirely. She is alone in Ohio, knocking on the door of a house in a quiet residential neighborhood, because a detail she noticed, a small, specific, locally grounded detail that the institutional approach had not weighted correctly, told her that the geography of the case pointed somewhere different. She is there not because she was sent. She is there because she followed the logic of the evidence to where it actually led, rather than to where the institution had already decided it led. Think about what that means for everything this film has been saying about institutional power and individual perception. The entire apparatus of federal law enforcement, with all its authority and all its resources and all its hierarchical confidence, is in the wrong place, and a trainee, alone, without authorization, without backup, without anyone who knows exactly where she is at the right door. That structural irony is not accidental. It is the film's thesis made into plot mechanics. It is the argument the film has been making through visual drama and performance and psychological texture. The argument about what genuine perception is worth against institutional authority rendered as a narrative event. The film is not just showing you that Clarice is right. It is showing you why she is right, because she is the kind of person who follows evidence rather than consensus, who looks rather than assumes, who carries the victims with her rather than treating them as data. The door opens, and Jim Uncombe, the man the investigation knows as Buffalo Bill, standing in his own home in his ordinary domestic reality, opens it and invites her in. And there's a moment just before she realizes what she has found and what she is standing inside that is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of dramatic irony in the film. She is asking him questions about a neighbor. She is maintaining the professional composure that has sustained her through every difficult situation in this story. She is doing her job, and the camera, and through the camera, you can see what she cannot yet see. You are ahead of her. You know, before she does, exactly whose house this is. And a specific quality of dread that produces the experience of watching someone move in full professional competence to a space that you know to be lethally dangerous is unlike almost anything else in the film that precedes it. It is not the dread of the monster revealed, it is the dread of the gap between what she knows and what you know, and it is the most purely cinematic moment of terror in the entire picture. Then she sees it, a specific physical detail, a moth, the specific species that has been present throughout the investigation, and the word of the scene changes completely in a fraction of a second. What was a professional interview becomes something else entirely. The gun comes out, he runs. And Clarice is suddenly inside the worst possible version of the situation she has been navigating all film, alone in the dark in a space she does not know, against someone whose capacity for violence she understands very well, with no backup and no way to call for it. The lights go out, and what follows is one of the most technically accomplished sequences in the film, a pursuit through complete darkness, shot and edited with a precision that uses your own disorientation as a dramatic instrument. You cannot see, she cannot see, the playing field has been leveled in the most terrifying possible way, and the film, in this darkness, asks you to experience something very close to what Clarice is experiencing, not through information, but through its deliberate, sustained withholding. The resolution of this sequence, the moment when it ends, when the sustained dread of that darkness finally breaks, arrives with a specificity that I find genuinely moving even now, even knowing it is coming. The click of a hammer being drawn back in the darkness, and then light. And then Clarice turning, firing, doing what she was trained to do at the precise moment when training and necessity converge. The sequence ends not with triumph exactly, not with the swelling score and the satisfied catharsis of conventional thriller resolution, but with something quieter and more ambivalent. She is standing in a room with a man who is dying, in a space that holds a young woman who is alive because Clarice got there in time, in a darkness that is just beginning to lift. And what Foster does in this moment, the specific quality of the stillness she brings to it, the specific way she moves to the space in the immediate aftermath, is the scene I mentioned in part 3 as the finest piece of acting in the film. She is shaking. Very slightly, very specifically, in the way a person who has been running on pure controlled adrenaline shakes when the adrenaline finally begins to release. She does not perform the shaking, it is simply there, and it tells you everything. It tells you that the composure was always costing something, that the management was always being paid for out of some reserve that is now, in this specific moment, temporarily depleted. She is a person who has just done something real, in the dark, alone, and the reality of it is landing on her body before her mind has fully processed it. That is not acting. That is the closest thing to truth that performance can reach. The survivor is blowed out. The case is closed. And then comes the institutional response, and the film does something with it that I think is one of its most quietly devastating choices. Clarice's superiors, who sent her into that situation without adequate preparation or support, who used her in their negotiation with Lecter without fully accounting for the cost, who were assembled at the wrong house when she was at the right one. These figures respond to what she has done with celebration and with pride, with a warmth that is in context almost grotesque, because the warmth is real, but it's the warmth of people who are celebrating an outcome without fully reckoning with how the outcome was arrived at, who are claiming a share of a success they did not particularly contribute to, who are wrapping her achievement in the language of institutional validation, of the institution recognizing and rewarding one of its own, without acknowledging what it cost her to serve that institution, or what the institution asked of her that it had no real right to ask. And Clarice stands inside this celebration and receives it with grace, with the same practiced composure she has brought to every institutional interaction in this film. And you watch her face, Foster's extraordinary face, carrying everything the performance has built over the entire film, and you see something that the celebration around her cannot quite reach, something that has been changed, not broken, not destroyed, but changed in the specific, permanent way that genuine experience always changes the people who survive it. She is not the person who ran through that grey forest in the opening image. Not entirely. Something has been spent. Something has been opened that cannot be fully closed. The film knows this. Foster's face knows this. And the film's willingness to let that knowledge exist alongside the celebration, to not resolve it, to not reassure you that she is fine, that it was worth it, that the institutional warmth is sufficient compensation for everything she paid, is one of its most honest and most quietly courageous artistic decisions. The graduation ceremony follows. Clarice receives her badge. She has arrived at the destination the opening image pointed toward. She has become officially what she was running toward in that grey morning forest. And the film marks this with a restraint that feels exactly right. No swelling music, no lingering on the achievement, just the specific quiet weight of something earned, something real. And then the phone call, the very last scene of the film, and the one that I think has been most consistently misread in the decades of discussion that have surrounded it. Lecter calls. He has escaped in circumstances the film does not dwell on, and he is somewhere warm, somewhere far from the institution that contained him. He speaks to Clarice briefly. What he says to her, this specific content of the exchange, I want to paraphrase rather than reproduce, because the specific words are less important than what the exchange is doing structurally and emotionally. He tells her in essence that he will not pursue her, that she is safe from him, specifically in a world where no one else is. He asks her something about whether she still hears the alarms, whether the silence she was running toward has a right. And then he spots someone he intends to pursue, someone from the institutional world that contained him, and the call ends with a smile in his voice that is among the most chilling sounds in the film. Not because it announces violence, though it does that, but because it announces the resumption of something, the reassertion of who he is and what he does, having fulfilled whatever private obligation he felt toward her. The monster, having been briefly and genuinely interested in a human being, returns to being a monster, without guilt, without hesitation, without any sense that the warmth he felt for her has produced any lasting modification of his fundamental nature. What does this ending mean? I have sat with it for a long time, and I want to offer you my most honest reading of it, because I think it is more complicated and more troubling than the cultural processing of it as a coolly iconic final image has allowed it to be. The ending is asking you to feel something double. On one level, it is the closing of the Clarice story on a note of genuine achievement. She has done what she set out to do. She has earned her badge. The lambs, at least for now, are silent. On another level, it is an acknowledgement that the world remains exactly as dangerous as it was when the film began. That the specific danger she was running toward, the monster in the dark, the incomprehensible violence at the edge of the world, has not been eliminated, has not been contained, has simply been redirected at her specific request, away from her and toward someone else. The resolution is personal, it is not universal. She is safe, someone else is not, and the film ends on that double knowledge, on the smile in his voice, on the warmth of the tropical sunlight, on the gap between what she has achieved and what the world continues to be, with a directorial composure that refuses to tell you how to feel about the distance between those two things. Here is what I keep returning to about that ending. Clarice asked the lecturer in one of the early exchanges not to come after her if he ever got out, and he agreed, and he kept that agreement. And the film presents this as something genuine, as evidence of the specific quality of what existed between them, of the specific value he placed on her that he places on nothing and no one else. And that is both genuinely moving and genuinely disturbing simultaneously, in a way that the film never fully unpacks. Because what it means is that Clarice's safety, the safety she carries with her into that final sunny frame, is not the product of justice or of institutional protection or of the elimination of danger. It is the product of a monster's personal affection. She is safe because a man who has never chosen not to harm anyone chose not to harm her. That is not resolution. That is not the closing of a circle. That is the most uncomfortable possible reminder that the world is not made safe by intelligence or by effort or by earned achievement. It is made at best provisionally navigable by the specific contingent unreliable choices of the specific contingent unreliable people in it, even the monstrous ones, especially the monstrous ones. And that finally is what I find most genuinely profound about this film. When it works, when it is being its best self, when the craft and the intelligence and the genuine artistic ambition are all firing together. It does not offer you a world that becomes safe, it offers you a person who becomes capable, and it asks you, quietly, without insisting, with a restraint that is itself a form of respect, whether that is enough, whether the silence that Clarice finally earns is a real silence or simply a pause, whether the lambs have stopped crying or whether she has simply learned at considerable personal cost to hear the word differently, whether the warning has arrived somewhere or is simply always continuing. Those questions do not have clean answers. The film knows they do not, and it ends with the composure of something that has genuinely earned its ambiguity on the sound of a man walking through sunlight toward someone who does not yet know what is coming, which is, in the end, the only honest image the film could have chosen, because that is the world, that is always the world. And Clarice, badge in hand, composure restored, lamps silent for now, is somewhere in it, running still, towards something she is not yet permitted to reach, or perhaps at last towards something she already has, the kind flux. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, Part 6 or 6 continued from previous movements 11, 12, and 13. What remains? Let me step away from analysis now. Let me put down the critical vocabulary, the structural observations, the careful architecture of argument and counterargument that has carried us through this essay. Let me simply speak to you as a person who sat with this film, who gave it time and attention and genuine openness, and who is now trying to account honestly for what it left behind. Because films leave things behind, even the ones you resist, even the ones that frustrate you or unsettle you or fail to deliver what their reputations promised, sometimes especially those. The residue of a complicated experience is often richer and stranger and more lasting than the residue of a simple pleasure. And this film left something behind in me that I've been trying to name precisely for longer than I expected when I first pressed play. What it left is not warm. It is not the particular glow of a film that embraced you and held you and sent you back into the world feeling more human than when you arrived. It is something colder and more specific than that. It left me with a particular image, not the most famous image in the film, not the one that has become the cultural shorthand for what this film is, but a smaller one, a quieter one. The image of Clarice walking back up through the corridor of the detention facility after one of her earliest exchanges with Lecter. Walking away from the class, moving back through the locked doors, back toward the daylight, back toward the institutional world that sent her there, and the specific quality of how she walks, not quickly, not slowly, not with relief or with dread, simply with a kind of forward continuity, a putting of one foot in front of the other that has been going on for a long time before this moment and that will go on for a long time after it. The walk of someone who has decided, not once but continuously, to keep going, who makes that decision again with every step, who does not require certainty or safety or the assurance that the walking will arrive somewhere in order to continue walking. That image has not left me. I do not think it will. Did this film change how I see something? I want to answer that question carefully because I think the honest answer is yes and no simultaneously, and the precision of the distinction matters. It did not change how I see the world in the sweeping, transformative way that the films I love most deeply have changed it, the films that rearranged something fundamental in how I understand what it means to be alive and in relationship with other people. It did not do that. But it sharpened something. It made more precise a question I had been carrying without quite knowing its exact shape. The question of what genuine perception costs. the question of whether clarity, real clarity, the kind that does not look away, is a gift that the person who carries it gets to enjoy, or simply a burden that they are required to bear on behalf of the rest of us who find it easier to look away. That question is sharper in me now than it was before I spent time with this film. And a film that sharpens a real question, even if it does not answer it, has done something real. Would I return to this film? Yes, not with eagerness, not with the specific anticipation of pleasure that draws me back to the films I love without complication, but with the particular quality of attention that complicated things demand. The attention that is partly curiosity and partly the need to understand why something affected you in the way it did, and partly the simple honesty of acknowledging that some experiences are worth returning to precisely because they are not comfortable. I would return to the Lecter scenes. I would return to Foster's performance in its entirety because I think there are still things in it that I have not yet fully seen. I would return to Demi's visual glamour, the close-ups, the institutional corridors, the specific quality of light in that basement cell, because I believe it has more to teach me about how cinema can use space as psychological statement. I would not return with uncritical admiration, but I would return with genuine respect. And genuine respect for something this complicated feels more honest and more durable than uncritical admiration ever could. What kind of person will carry this film with them? The person who has ever felt the specific exhaustion of being the only one in a room who is paying full attention. The person who has ever traded something private and protected for something they needed more than they needed the protection. The person who has ever looked at suffering clearly, without flinching, without the comfortable reduction of it to abstraction, and felt the weight of that clarity as both a gift and a cost simultaneously. The person who has ever been in a room designed for someone else and navigated it with a practiced efficiency that concealed from everyone around them exactly how much that navigation required. Those people will find something in this film that speaks to them directly and specifically, something that says, I see you, I know what this cost, I am not going to tell you it does not. And now, the final thought, The Silence of the Lambs is a film of genuine and significant achievement in several areas: the central performance, the directorial vision, the specific quality of the relationship at its emotional core, and of genuine and significant failure in others, most critically in its handling of the character whose presence creates the film's most serious and most lasting ethical problem. It is not a masterpiece its reputation insists it is. It is something more interesting than that. It is a film in which extraordinary ambition and real artistic intelligence exist in uncomfortable proximity to a failure of moral imagination. A film that sees some things with extraordinary clarity and other things with a blindness that cannot be entirely explained by the limitations of its era. That combination does not produce a masterpiece. It produces something more human, something more honest about the nature of artistic achievement itself, which is never clean, never complete, never the pure expression of uncompromised vision that we sometimes pretend great art is. Great art is made by people who see some things clearly and miss others entirely. People whose wisdom and whose limitations are inseparable, woven together in every frame, every choice, every image that ends up on screen. Who will love this film most deeply? The viewer who can hold its achievements and its failures simultaneously, who can appreciate the extraordinary craft and the genuine psychological intelligence without requiring those qualities to redeem the genuine problems. The viewer who brings to cinema the same quality of attention that Clarice brings to her work, who looks at what is actually there, not at what the reputation says should be there, who may not connect with it. Anyone who arrives expecting the genre thriller its marketing has always presented it as, and finds instead a film that moves at a different temperature and asks a different kind of patience. Anyone for whom the tonal inconsistency of the build scenes creates a distance that the lecter's sequences cannot fully bridge. And anyone for whom the film's central ethical failure, the conflation of violence with gender nonconformity that a disclaimer does not adequately undo, is a wound too significant to look past. Those responses are valid, they are grounded in what is genuinely there, they should not be dismissed in the rush to celebrate what is also genuinely there, See this in the best quality you can find. It is a film whose visual grammar rewards the largest, clearest, most detailed image you can give it. A film where the specific quality of light in every frame, the specific texture of every environment, carries information that compression and small screens diminish. It deserves to be seen properly. Even now, even at a complicated relationship, I would say especially now, because the complications are part of the experience and the experience is worth having. My rating 5.2 out of 10. And here is the one true sentence that earns it. This is a film I cannot dismiss and cannot fully embrace. A film that achieved something rare and failed at something important in almost the same breath, and that left me with a sharper question than it found me carrying, which is perhaps the most honest thing a complicated piece of art can do. The last image I want to leave you with is not from the film's ending. It is from its beginning. That young woman alone in a grey forest, pulling herself up and over and forward in light that offers no warmth toward something she has not yet been permitted to reach, turning not because she is certain of arrival, but because stopping was never an option she was willing to consider. There is something in that image, something about the specific quality of a person who keeps going in conditions that do not particularly encourage going, that I find more moving than almost anything else the film offers. More moving than the famous sequences, the iconic exchanges, the moments that the cultural mythology has elevated to legend. Just a person, just a grey forest, just the sound of effort, just a continuous, quiet, unglamorous decision to continue. Cinema rarely gives you something that's simple and that true at the same time. When it does, you remember it long after the legend has worn smooth, long after the references have become references to references. You remember the image. You remember what it felt like the first time you understood what it was saying, and you carry it forward the way she carries everything forward, one step at a time, in light that offers nothing, towards something that may or may not be waiting at the end. Now, before I let you go, thank you, genuinely and specifically. Thank you for spending this time with me and with this film. An essay this long about a film this complicated requires something real from the person on the other side of it. It requires a willingness to sit with difficulty, to stay with ambiguity, to follow an argument through its complications rather than waiting for a clean conclusion that was never going to arrive. You did that, and that means something to me. If this essay gave you something, a new angle on a film you thought you knew, a question you had not been carrying before, a moment that made you want to go back and look again, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments. Tell me which moment in this film has stayed with you. Tell me whether you agree that the film's treatment of its secondary antagonist is a genuine wound or whether you think the argument has been overstated. Tell me whether Foster's performance on your most recent viewing does what I said it does. These conversations are what the Cineflux exists for, not conclusions, conversations. And I want to ask you something else. Do you think a film can be genuinely great despite a genuine moral failure at its center? Or does the failure of moral imagination, wherever it occurs, however brilliant the surrounding work, fundamentally limit what a film can be? That question does not have a clean answer. I have been living inside it for a long time. I would like to know where you live inside it. One more. If you were to make the case that this film deserves a higher rating than I gave it, if you were to argue, from the evidence of what is actually on screen, that the achievements outweigh the shortcomings more decisively than I concluded, what would your best argument be? I am genuinely asking, because the most interesting conversations about cinema are the ones where someone who felt it differently can show you something you miss. Coming up next on the Cineflux, we are going somewhere very different, a film that operates at the opposite temperature from everything we visited today. A film about stillness rather than urgency, about presence rather than pursuit, about the kind of cinema that trusts silence not as dramatic technique but as the primary language of human experience. I cannot wait to sit with you inside it. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.